Okay, so this is the audio review for Chapter 2, Science and Social Research, from Theory to Data and Back. So first we have to just understand what the goals of science itself is. So science is guided by theory, but it can also produce or add to existing theory. So the first goal, or the first characteristic of science, is the goal of producing knowledge in the form of theory. So this is a logically interconnected set of propositions that explain something about how the world works. And it's important to point out that while some think that a theory is very tentative and only a law is credible, science no longer describes laws, right? In the same way, they see theories as a body of information that's constantly being expanded without static permanent definition. So second characteristic of science is the reliance on verifiable data. So again, information observable to both the researcher and others. So it can be corroborated by others independently, which is essential to getting at the facts, whether you're looking at social science or any other form of science. The third characteristic is the use of systematic procedures in data collection and analysis. So when you follow the steps outlined in Chapter 1 and understand that this knowledge is based on a series of steps, that lends credibility to the conclusions of that research. And then the fourth characteristic is the application of logical reasoning in generating and testing scientific knowledge. So reasoning is when we proceed from certain information to conclusions based on that information. So we use logic to evaluate the correctness of our reasoning and to determine how justified a conclusion is based on evidence. There are two main kinds of logical reasoning, deductive and inductive, which we're going to talk about in a sec. Okay, so, theory itself is integral to science because science involves a constant interplay between theory and data. So first, theory informs data, right? As the theory helps you determine what, kind of methodological approach you might have. And the data itself informs theory. So what you find from testing theory can also improve theory or expand upon theories. So theory underlies the entire research process, guiding the formulation of research questions. So this is guided and inspired by the theory. And the question is half of the balance. The method a researcher chooses is the one that will answer the research question. Theory underlies guiding choices about how to conduct a study. So, AKA your literature review, right? Where you're learning about all the previous information or theories interpreting your topic. And interpretation of data, which is also connected to theory, as once the data is collected, theory is going to help the researcher make sense of what they found. So there's a couple things, and we're going to talk about this through Chapter 2, Chapter 3, but forms of logical reasoning. So there's deductive and inductive logic. So deductive logic is reasoning in which the conclusion necessarily follows if the evidence is true. So meaning, if the evidence is true, the conclusion must also be true. So this is a very Sherlock Holmes kind of approach, right? While inductive logic is the reasoning in which the conclusion is implied by or goes beyond the evidence at hand. So if the evidence is true, the conclusion may or may not be true in inductive logic. So we'll get to that. We'll get to some examples of that. So science uses both forms of reasoning, and each represents a different way of moving between theory and data. So I have a little video here that should help kind of illuminate this. But inductive, again, another example of inductive would be if you're, let's say you eat at a restaurant and you get food poisoning. You might not want to eat at that restaurant again, even though the conclusion is not necessarily supported, meaning eating the food will not necessarily cause you to get food poisoning again, but you might avoid it because it's not worth it to get it, right? Or I know people that do that. They drink too much of one kind of liquor and get sick, and then from then on they don't drink that kind of liquor because they have associated getting sick with that, right? But the conclusion may or may not be true. You might be able to drink that same liquor and not get sick, but Inductive logic tells you that there's a likelihood that will happen. And that's enough for most people. So again, I'm going to show you a video clip here that really kind of illuminates some of this.
In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the difference between inductive and deductive research. This was one of the more complicated concepts that I myself had, trouble understanding, and so I'm gonna. It took me a while to learn this, so I understand if this is kind of a difficult concept for you to understand. Hopefully, I can explain it to you that in a way that helps you learn it a little bit quicker than I did. So, before we talk about the difference between inductive and deductive research, I want to introduce you to the research circle. The research circle is a visual diagram that represents the research process. And there are four basic components of the research process. Theory, which represents a set of ideas that help you explain a particular social phenomenon. A hypothesis, which is a testable prediction about the relationship between two or more variables. Empirical observations, things that you pick out and identify or can label in the social world. And then analysis, things like statistics and qualitative data analysis, where you're analyzing themes from interviews or observations, or using statistics to identify patterns within numerical data. So these are the different components of the research process. Inductive and deductive research specify kind of where you begin on this research project, where your research journey starts. That is really what distinguishes inductive from deductive research, because in inductive research, you begin with a research question, and that research question guides your collection of empirical data, which you then use to generate a testable hypothesis or a tentative hypothesis, which you confirm with additional data. And then that data becomes the basis for forming a social theory, a set of ideas that you can use to explain your topic. So with inductive research, you're beginning by collecting data. So you're collecting empirical observations about the social world. Based on those empirical observations, you're forming a hypothesis, which you then use to test with additional data to develop a theory. So in inductive research, you're beginning with empirical observations. Now that differs from deductive research, in which you begin by reviewing a particular social theory, and based on that theory, you form a hypothesis, which you then test with empirical data, and either confirm or refute that hypothesis based on your analysis of that data. So deductive research approaches begin with a theory-driven hypothesis. So there might be an existing theory to explain a particular topic, and you form a hypothesis that's based on that theory, which then guides your data collection and analysis. So you might design a particular survey to collect information about a set of variables in your hypothesis, which you then analyze, and that feeds back to the theory. So you might add to or maybe revise a particular theory based on your analysis. Now let me give you some examples of inductive and deductive research approaches. An example of an inductive research question might be, how do undergraduate students view the causes of homelessness? What do they perceive as the solutions to homelessness? So, rather than identifying an existing social theory, with this research question, you might begin by collecting data from a group of undergraduate students and really try to understand how they view the causes of homelessness. What do they perceive as the solutions to homelessness? So this was a published article in the Journal of Poverty recently, and this is inductive because you're beginning by with a set of you're beginning by collecting data. You're interviewing students and trying to understand how they view the causes of homelessness and how they view the solutions, and then these observations might lead you to develop a hypothesis where you test with data and you use that information to develop a theory. So it's inductive because you're starting with the data collection. Now, deductive, an example of a research question that's more deductive in nature is are perceptions of discrimination among young adults related to psychological distress? And does discrimination help to explain racial differences in depressive symptoms? So this research question is deductive because it actually these research questions and the hypotheses that can be formulated from the research question are sort of drawing from an existing social theory. It's actually the stress process theory that specifies how stress is related to health and how social characteristics affect exposure to stress and how personal social resources moderate the relationship between stress and health. And so based on the stress process theory, this researcher was able to conduct a study to form a hypothesis about one form of social stress, discrimination, and how it relates to psychological distress. So this was deductive research in the sense that there was an existing social theory. The researcher formed a hypothesis, collected data in the form of a survey, and used that data to analyze and test that hypothesis and update existing social theory.
Okay, so specifically deductive logic, this is a process that's moving from theory to hypothesis to data. So from the theory and its propositions, a researcher develops a hypothesis or prediction about the relationship between variables in their research. So basically, what they think they will find in their results. This is stated at the end of the literature review in sociological research papers because the hypothesis comes from an examination of previous theory and analysis. So this reflects a top-down approach from the abstract theory to the concrete data. A hypothesis is an expected relationship between phenomena derived from theory and tested with data to determine whether the hypothesis was correct or the relationship between the variables was as predicted. So you have this little figure here that kind of explains the process itself, while inductive is kind of the reversal of that, right? So inductive logic of inquiry, the process moves from data to empirical patterns to theory. So when a researcher analyzes the data, they infer empirical patterns that represent general tendencies that are found in the data. So this reflects a bottom-up approach from the concrete data to the abstract theory. So as you go from what's known to what is interpretable. And an empirical pattern is a relationship between phenomena inferred from data. So it is not an absolute certainty, just as the food poisoning example I gave, but there is a relationship between what you eat and getting sick. So the possibility of that is there. So this is why it can be abstract when looking at an individual piece of data, but when you replicate these results and combine with more other similar findings, your study becomes what we call grounded in the theory and empirical patterns that emerge from the data and analysis of that data. So some examples of how deductive and inductive logic actually show up in research. It can be confusing to try to sort out deductive from inductive at first, so the book gives some really concrete examples of the logic processes as it applies to different sociological studies, which can be very helpful. So the first one is about whether or not contact reduces prejudice, right? So the hypothesis is derived from the contact theory of prejudice. So the contact theory of prejudice argues that the greater the contact with members of a different ethnic or racial group, the lower the prejudice towards that group will be. meaning that people have a tendency to see themselves and those like them as one group or the in-group, and people who are different in some characteristics, such as language, as the out-group. So if sociocultural factors say that the out-group is bad or inferior, then the in-group will likely feel that way about the out-group. So that's what he's looking at as the basis of the theory. So the impact of contact on prejudice depends on the social setting, meaning that one way to change perceptions of out-group representation or to reduce animosity towards out-group members is through interpersonal contact between groups, which exposes in-group members to the real people behind the stereotypes, so they learn new information about them, which can dispel those stereotypes and hostility, right? So based on this theory, the researchers are hypothesizing, and again, this shows the move from theory to hypothesis, focusing on how stereotypes are affected by contact with family, school, and other settings. So their hypothesis were that whites who have black relatives will be less likely to hold anti-black stereotypes than whites that do not have black relatives because of the high degree of intimacy, relative frequency of contact that family members have, that family contact should disconfirm negative stereotypes in their view, based on the theory. Their second hypothesis was that whites who personally know blacks from school will be less likely to hold anti-black stereotypes than whites who do not know blacks from school. So the contact in school is not as intimate as a family, but it does fit some of the conditions of Alpert's theory that they're basing this on. So they think that the setting should also disconfirm stereotypes. So survey data supported the second hypothesis, but not the first. So basically, to their surprise, whites with black relatives were just as likely to hold prejudicial views as whites without black family members. But whites who knew blacks from school settings were less likely to express anti-black stereotypes than whites who did not know black students in school. So what's important to see is that they started with theory, they made a hypothesis, collected data to test it. So their study adds to the knowledge about the strengths and weaknesses of the overall theory. All right, so now the book gives an example of research through inductive logic. So how class matters, social class. So first, the researcher gathered data through direct observation and in-depth interviews to examine social class in everyday lives. So this was done by interviewing parents of elementary and middle school children, focusing on a dozen families for what was called intensive observations, including visiting the family in and around their house, going through their daily routines, their school activities, even their church events and services, and medical appointments. So through this, a lot of data was collected. So then when this is done, there are inferred empirical patterns in the data related to social class. So starting with all the data, a researcher codes or searches for empirical patterns in the data, meaning things that keep popping out, and in many respondents' interactions and interviews. So researchers start looking at all of these emerging patterns as they pore over the data and come to understandings about the general patterns. So what she found was that middle-class parents more frequently reason and negotiate with their children, and middle-class children more often participate in organized activities. So from this was derived a theory of child rearing. So the data comes first, then the theory is derived from it. So she argues that middle-class parents use a strategy of concerted cultivation, meaning that they foster their child's talents and care about their opinions and really work to improve the areas in which they're skillful. So the organization of their family life often revolves around the children's activities that are orchestrated by adults, such as playing Little League, right? And the parents often reason and negotiate with their kids, which gives kids the opportunity to criticize their parents' decisions. And so what emerges is a sense of entitlement in the kids as they think their point of view is very important, right? Versus in working class parents, they would practice an accomplishment of natural growth approach, meaning that parents care for their kids, but they don't put them in the same structured activities that often cost a lot of money that lower income parents need to provide necessities for their families. So time by these kids is often spent hanging out with siblings or other family members or friends. They're often given directives and not given the opportunity to question or debate their parents' decisions, which means they are more accepting of directives. But when in school, they feel a sense of powerlessness and frustration as their conflicts between their home life and reality and the more middle-class mindset of the educational institution. So instead of entitlement, they develop restraint and feel as, in a sense, things are the way they are. Interestingly, they don't talk about this in the book, but this continues through higher education, as middle-class students will often do the things that help them achieve success in college that may feel uncomfortable to working class students because of that entitlement mindset. So middle class students will more often come to office hours, will ask for favors or extensions, right? Will barter for grades, which is never appreciated. While lower income students who haven't had this kind of concerted cultivation will feel uncomfortable, right? They'll feel imposing going to office hours. They're not going to ask for favors or extensions, and they're going to accept the grades and the barriers that they face in higher education without the same entitled reaction, which means that kind of puts them at a disadvantage, right? So really, it just shows that social class is organizing our daily lives and that we experience the world differently because of our social class is really what she was trying to study. Okay, so there are strengths and limitations to both deductive and inductive inquiry. Deductive has the advantage of theory providing a focus, but on the flip side of that, the chosen theory may blind the researcher to other theory in deductive inquiry. Inductive has the advantage of creating new theory, while it's limited because the interpretability, meaning there are many ways to interpret the inductive findings. So to get past these limitations but keep the strengths, many researchers combine these logics to some extent. So, looking at Durkheim's study of suicide gives a good example of this. So he began with deductive logic. Durkheim tested psychological theories of suicide that were popular at the time. I mean, really, he was just trying to say, like, hey, sociology's cool, because just as it is today, psychology was the very dominant discipline of the time. So I think he's taking a little dig at psychology here. But anyway, so the popular psychological argument was that suicide was the result of insanity. So using deductive logic, he derived hypotheses from those theories that as rates of insanity increase, so too would suicide rates. That women, because, oh man, we could get into that, the political and social understandings of that time period that often conflated women with mental illness. So women were seen as having more issues of psychological distress than men, which, we could get into that all day. But anyway, hence the term hysteria coming from the root word, anyway, I'm getting off topic. Okay, so women would have higher rates of suicide than men because of the understandings of that psychological time period, and that people with Jewish faith would have higher rates of suicide than members of other religious groups. So he looked at data from official statistics on suicide, and they failed to support those hypotheses from psychological theory. So first he found that European countries with the highest insanity rates did not have the highest suicide rates. Men have much higher suicide rates than women. And Jewish people had the lowest rate of suicide of all the religious groups that he looked at. So this means he had disproved the existing theory, so it was time to switch to inductive approach to develop a new theory of suicide. So he kind of flipped this to his theory of suicide. So he continued with inductive logic. Durkheim identified several empirical patterns in the data. So first, that predominantly Catholic countries and areas of countries with a strong Catholic presence had lower suicide rates than their Protestant counterparts. Mostly because of the differences in individual thought between the religions, right? Catholicism is not going to be like, hey, why don't you question things, right? As a person who went to Catholic school, let me just tell you, nope, that's not something they encourage. Married people were less likely to commit suicide than unmarried people, and that people with children were less likely to commit suicide than people without children. So from these patterns, Durkheim derived a theory of suicide. So he said, suicide varies inversely with the degree of integration of the social groups in which the individual forms a part. So having a family, for instance, can be an immunity or a safeguard against suicide. So, what is the point of all of this scientific knowledge stuff, right? What is possible from scientific knowledge? So science has an amazing potential to offer new knowledge that might, not be gained through other means. It can also dispel common sense ideas that may not be true. A lot of our stereotypes come from these quote unquote common sense notions. Scientific knowledge can also confirm ideas that we are unsure of, right? To prove these things to us, to help us analyze the world. It will also help us make better choices in our everyday lives, right? Because the more information we have, the more informed we are, the more careful choices we can make. And really improve the human condition. So equipped with updated and modern scientific knowledge, scientists and others can help improve the human condition with new treatments or social programs or things that can help alleviate the social problems of today. Of course, there's still limits of scientific knowledge, right? There's ways in which science is not perfect. So first is that scientific knowledge is tentative. So it can't be proven beyond a doubt. So it's also a reflection of sociological research of the social world. It's something that is changing and is in flux. So for instance, Durkheim's findings on suicide have been tested again and again. And while some of what he found held true throughout time, such as men committing suicide more than women, his religious arguments have not held, right? Also, the scientific process is sometimes unpredictable or unsystematic. So in the chapter, they talk about the Hawthorne effect. So the Hawthorne effect was when, they were trying to do this research on worker productivity, and he had a specific hypothesis that by changing a specific variable, worker productivity would increase. And so what happened was, though, he did this with like a bunch of different variables, right? So say turn up the lights and the productivity increased. Turn down the lights, the productivity increased. Give people a break, or take away their breaks. And no matter what, the productivity went up. And so finally they started to realize it's not the actual specific variables that he was measuring. It was the fact that the people being studied knew they were being researched. So they were more productive. Because when your boss brings in someone to measure your productivity, you're probably going to be productive, right? So, oftentimes it can be unsystematic or just not really, looking at what it should be looking at. Also, it's a product of its time. So knowledge depends on the socio-historical context, right? So research that Durkheim did was situated in his historical time period. And there's been plenty of quote-unquote science that's justified discrimination and inequality that were the value systems of that time period, which is why we really need to be critical about the research we're producing in the current day. And there's also the human element in science that may lead to errors in collecting and interpreting evidence. So we're people. People can make mistakes or errors. So science may not be perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than the Dark Age mindset that preceded it. And as we do more and more research, we contribute to paradigms that help us better understand the world by putting all the individual studies together to get a better picture.